الله بالخير. في جنوب أفريقيا لطالما لعب المسلمون دورا رئيسيا في النضال ضد نظام الفصل العنصري الأبرتهايد، حيث يتجاوز تأثيرهم عددهم الفعلي. في سيرته الذاتية أن تكون مسلما يربط الباحث في الشؤون الإسلامية الجنوب أفريقي فريد إسحق بين العقيدة الإسلامية وانتقاد الاستعمار والإمبريالية والهيمنة الغربية، ويدعو إلى العدالة الاجتماعية والمساواة في الحقوق. من هم مسلمو جنوب أفريقيا وما مدى تأثيرهم؟ وما الذي يجمع بينهم وبين قضايا الأمة؟ كيف أثرت حركات التحرير الوطني الفلسطيني في مسار التحرر من الأبرتهايد في جنوب أفريقيا؟ هل وفرت الديمقراطية المساواة لذوي البشرة السوداء في هذا البلد المتنوع الثقافات؟ وفي ظل تعرض النظام الدولي لتحديات جدية اليوم، هل بات من الملح مراجعة دور الأمم المتحدة الإنساني؟ نرحب بكم ونرى ونسمع أكثر من ضيفنا الأستاذ فريد إسحق، رئيس مجلس إدارة حركة المقاطعة BDS في جنوب أفريقيا في البعد الأقرب. هذه الميادين وأنا زينب الصفار، خليكم ويانا. Professor Farid Isaac, South African Muslim scholar, author and political activist, a veteran of the struggle against apartheid, chairperson of BDS South Africa board, served as a commissioner for gender equality with Nelson Mandela's government, an activist in the inter-religious solidarity movement for justice and peace. Professor Farid Isaac, salam and welcome to Al-Mayadeen. This is The Proximate Aspect. I'm Zainab Al-Saffar. Pure pleasure to have you, sir.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Zainab. The pleasure is also mine to be with you.
Most welcome, sir. Well, it is a fact that Muslims played a key role in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And to this day, their influence goes far beyond their actual number. Might you, sir, explain who are these Muslims and how do they relate to the universal Ummah?
Thank you very much for that question. Firstly, South African Muslims, originally, the first Muslims came from the Indonesian archipelago, today Indonesia and Malaysia, and they were brought to South Africa as political exiles by the Dutch, who was at the same time in control of Batavia and the Indonesian archipelago on the whole. So the more difficult resistance leaders, and among them were kings, who the Dutch felt that the influence had to be cut, given how formidable leaders they were against the Dutch occupation. And they were then exiled to the Cape, which at that time was known Cape Raja al-Salih, the Cape of Good Hope. So that is the first generation of Muslims in South Africa. And so they lived here as exiles and they lived as slaves. And the one remarkable thing is over this more than 360 years, they retained their identity. But not only did they retain their identity, they played a leading role in the communities where they were.
Mm-hmm.
For example, during one of the states of emergency that the apartheid regime declared, in the first one in the early 1980s, they had detained thousands of people. And when I systematically went through the list of the detainees, I found that 16% of the people on that list were Muslim. In the first South African Democratic Parliament under Nelson Mandela, 12% of all the people in Parliament were Muslims. Our country's first Chief Justice was Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
Our country's first Minister of Transport, Minister of Justice, Minister of Science and Technology, our current Minister of Finance,
Mm-hmm.
our current Minister of International Relations,
Mm-hmm.
and a number of other deputy ministers are Muslim.
Yes. Allow me to ask you, sir, you reckon that all of us are forced by the context of September 11th to find a sort of moderate Islam, a beautiful Islam, a gentle Islam, as you term it. Not that Islam is not all of these. Why should the context of occupation not force us to find an angry Islam, as you may propose? Can Muslims express their anger against unjust socio-economic systems without being labeled as terrorists, or must they not?
Well, I think we have a limited option into how we are being labeled. We have to ensure that we are not responsible ourselves for inappropriate or slanderous labels.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, we have two responsibilities. The first responsibility is to resist oppression, to resist occupation of our lands, and to fight. And that responsibility we need to be unashamed of.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is often with the way in which we resist and our language of resistance.
But in this sense, sir, you say there is a path between dehumanizing fundamentalism and fossilized traditionalism. This is a path of radical Islam committed to social justice, to individual liberty, and the quest for the transcendent, who is beyond all institutional, religious, and dogmatic constructions. Great, beautiful. When you say dehumanizing fundamentalism and fossilized traditionalism, I would appreciate, sir, if you explain, elucidate, and examine these nomenclatures, these terms, these jargons. What is actually meant by dehumanizing fundamentalism and fossilized traditionalism? And how could radical Islam be committed to social justice? When you say the word radical, it is to be associated with something else.
Okay, so on the one hand, there is this group today in the Muslim world who are largely regarded as fundamentalists. They don't self-ascribe as fundamentalists because in the Islamic nomenclature, a fundamentalist is somebody who sticks to the usul of the deen, the basic principles of the deen. And to this extent, it is a requirement of all Muslims to stick to the usul. But in general language now, the fundamentalists are portrayed as the people who want to establish a political state in the world today. That's the first thing. And the second thing, by whatever means possible. And that includes, qital or jihad bis-sayf and so on.
Mm-hmm.
The other category and they often confuse between the two, is the radicals. Radical Muslims want a complete transformation of the socio-political balance that there is in the world and the moral foundations of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in theory, there is really nothing wrong with being a Muslim radical. There is nothing wrong with being any kind of radical. If somebody says that, look, I am not happy only with giving charity whenever there is blood on our TV screens because of the Israelis bombing the Palestinian people, then I rush to give charity. If somebody says, yeah, Habibi, that's short-sighted. Mm-hmm. Not only should we give charity when we see the blood on our TV screens, we should always be giving charity. Mm-hmm. But more important than that, we need to give money to ensure the collapse of those who keep on throwing the bomb.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we need an end. Mm-hmm. We need an end to the international regime that keeps on supporting that government that keeps on throwing the bomb and creates ethnic cleansing. We can't only provide houses once people's homes have been bombed or demolished by bulldozers. Mm-hmm. So that is a radical approach.
So that's
the person is saying, hey,
right. So that's your explanation, sir, of what it means to be a radical Muslim. It's not to be associated with extreme terrorism and terrorism whatsoever, but to be a full practiced Muslim. True, right?
Absolutely, but a Muslim with a radical outlook. I want to get also to the causes of the injustice, not only the results of the injustice.
Sure. A major South African street in Sandton, Johannesburg, was named after the Palestinian freedom fighter Layla Khalid. How did the Palestinian liberation movement influence South Africans during their liberation struggle?
Well, firstly, it was the African National Congress. When the ANC was in exile, South Africa was, along with a number of other countries, it was Cuba, it was the Palestinians, it was a number of other entities, okay? And the ANC was in solidarity with them. They were in solidarity with South Africa. So this, on the one hand, a political relationship there. Secondly, Israel, since its establishment and the Nakba, was a major ally of the apartheid regime. The apartheid regime supplied the Israeli government from 48 onwards with arms to fight the Palestinians, and later as the Israeli arms industry increased, they sold arms to South Africa. All of that was common knowledge among South Africans. And then, TV was introduced in South Africa much later, in 1974, 75. And then, of course, we could actually access some of the things that were happening inside Palestine. Subsequent to that, a number of political and trade union leaders went from South Africa to Palestine. At the time when the call for the boycott wasn't that widespread, and at the time when the Israelis were still willing to let other people in, so that, in the words of the Israelis, they could see the true face of Israel. You know, oppressors always think they live in their own cuckoo land, where they think that their place, if you just watch what we're really doing, you'll see how humane we really are. So every single South African political leader, with one exception, Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who was the leader of an apartheid tribal homeland at that time. But every single black person that went from South Africa came back from Palestine and Israel saying, gosh, man, this is much worse than life had ever been under apartheid. One of our trade union leaders, said that apartheid Israel is a Sunday school picnic compared to what we underwent under apartheid. And so the solidarity movement grew.
Exactly. And also, sir, upon his visit to Al-Quds, late South African Nobel Prize winner Archbishop Desmond Tutu said on the Israeli apartheid, quote, "I've been very deeply distressed. In my visit to the Holy Land, it reminded me so much of what happened to us Black people in South Africa. Today, as you said, as we commemorate 75 years to the Nakba, are Israel's past and present horrendous practices and atrocities to be compared to South African apartheid?"
You know, more than 10, 12 years ago, I went to Palestine. And I went to speak at a Sabeel conference, perhaps 15 years ago. And at the immigration, when I arrived there, they asked me, "What am I doing?" So I said, "I am coming to speak at a conference." What? So I said, "I'm coming to speak at the Sabeel conference." And they said, "About what?" So I said, "Oh, I'm coming to speak about Israel and is it an apartheid state?" So the guy asked me, what is your position on it? So I said, "Look, first, I'm not used to being asked questions about this before I come. I mean, I'm a free citizen. And I don't think you've got the right to ask me about what my position on this and that question is. But if you really have to know, I don't agree with that statement that apartheid is akin, that Israel is akin to apartheid South Africa." So he wanted to smile. And just before he smiled, I said, "Well, my position is that it's much worse than apartheid South Africa." So that has been my position then. Since then, I've become more and more aware of how much more insidious, how much more cruel apartheid Israel is. Let me give you just one example.
Please.
You know, the underpinning logic of white South Africa, it was never to wish away Black South Africans. Never. White South Africans always knew that they had to find some kind of accommodation with these Black South Africans. The logic of Zionism, that this land is for Jews all over the world, and Jews all over the world must be dragged, must be invited, must be cajoled, must be bribed to come here and live here. That logic means that the population that is there, the Palestinian population, that they have to be eased out. You can't have your basis ideology make space for all of these Jews across the world without asking the question, what happens to the people who live here?
The indigenous people, true.
They know what must happen to these indigenous people. They must be spirited away. They must be ethnically cleansed. Their homes and their fields must be destroyed. So the logic of ethnic cleansing, the logic of genocide and the elimination of an entire people in their history, it is a logic that is inherently tied to Zionism.
Very true.
This is unfortunately why there is absolutely no solution to the problem of Zionism, except that it must be ended.
The only path to confront Israeli Zionism and apartheid is through resistance and more resistance in all its facets. Now, Minister of International Relations Nelly Pandora of South Africa notes on the international community double measures and double standards in the case of Ukraine and Palestine. She says the sovereignty was important in the case of Ukraine invasion, but was never important for Palestine. the international community is using the framework
Look,
of international law.
Our minister, who, by the way, is
Yes, is looking at, they are using international law unequally depending on who's affected by that law. And that must change, sir. As a human rights defender, what is your revision and vision to revise and amend the international multilateral system to ensure it becomes fairer and on equal terms and distance to the oppressed, the disenfranchised, and the occupied peoples?
Well, the one is the line that Minister Pandora has gone, and how she has articulated the horror of this one-state hegemony all over the world. And when they decide that the pain of other white people is a real pain, that the occupation of another white people, that is the occupation that deserves the attention of the whole world. So it's a continuous calling out of those things at an international level. However, what is also acquired is the intensification of grassroots solidarity movements, the boycott movement, for example, the attempts to make Israel a pariah state in international relations at the ground level, the attempts, for example, to change one of the major streets in South Africa and change the name to Leila Khalid Drive. Leila Khalid Drive. And by the way, this is also the road that hosts the Israeli Chamber of Commerce in the center of Johannesburg. So it's both international work that is required, but also at an ordinary grassroots level, the awareness creation, the mobilization of people. You know, with South Africa in the apartheid era, we didn't have international country support. I mean, countries like Great Britain, countries like Germany, the United States, much of the global north, certainly the United Kingdom, they supported the apartheid regime. We should not forget that, you know, until 6 years after Mandela was the president of the country of South Africa, he was still on the United States' terrorist list. So we must not forget that it's never these countries that supported us, but it was ordinary communities in those countries that formed part of anti-apartheid movements, that boycotted South African flowers, South African oranges, that protested and made government that led to the change in attitudes towards the South African apartheid. And we can see this throughout the world now, in Germany, in Sweden, in South Africa, in many parts of the United States, that increasingly Palestinians and people in solidarity with them, they're turning the heat onto Israel and its allies.
Right.
And so I think that is the way for it to go. Just one, you know, in South Africa, we never actually knew when our freedom would come. We had the slogan, freedom or death, victory is certain. The other slogan that we had was freedom in our lifetime. But actually, you know, we never with our head believed that freedom would come in our life. It was a slogan that we held in our heart. And so often with the Palestinian people, it sometimes appears difficult to see, you know, in the words of the Quran, حتى يقول الرسول والذين آمنوا معه متى نصر الله. When is the help of Allah going to come? When, you know, when is there an end to all of this? So it's a legitimate question that they must start asking.
Hopefully, very, very soon we will leave it there, Professor.
ألا إن نصر الله قريب.
Sure. ونعم بالله. Professor Farid Isaac, illustrious South African Muslim scholar and BDS South Africa chair, thank you very much, sir, for sharing your exquisite perspective. Lovely talking to you always.
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام. إذن يمثل فريد إسحاق حركة تضامن يسارية في الجنوب العالمي وحركة فهم ديمقراطي وتعددي للإسلام الذي هو ضد التطرف والأصولية والعنف. لا يقبل إسحق أن تبقى مقارنته للوضع الحالي في إسرائيل مع الوضع في جنوب أفريقيا خلال حقبة الفصل العنصري غير معروفة وجلية وبارزة. هو يجزم بأن في الواقع الوضع أسوأ بكثير في الأراضي المحتلة، ولعل قادة بارزين آخرين في جنوب أفريقيا مثل نيلسون مانديلا والأسقف ديزموند توتو نددوا بوحشية ممارسات الاحتلال في فلسطين المحتلة بطريقة حادة مماثلة. قد يقال لقد تم القضاء على نظام الفصل العنصري في جنوب أفريقيا، ولكن هل تم استئصال هذه النزعة من نفوس من بقوا من هذا النظام البائد هناك ومن ممارساتهم حتى اليوم؟ وهل حقا انتزع المواطنون في جنوب أفريقيا حقهم من المستعمر؟ من كل الميادين، سلاما وتحية، في أمان الله.